Welcome back to the Knight Gambit TV, tactical battle between GM Pranesh M and GM Gukesh D from the Quantbox Chennai Grandmasters 2026. Part 1. The opening setup, moves 1 to 8. 1. Pawn e2 to e4. White begins with the most popular opening move, controlling the center square d5 and opening lines of development for both the light-squared bishop and the queen. 1. Pawn c7 to c6. Black chooses the Caro-Kann defense. The idea behind c6 is to support the solid center push d7, d5 on the very next move without blocking the light-squared bishop's path out. 2. Pawn d2 to d4. White claims full control over the central squares d4 and e4, placing two pawns side by side in a classical center structure. 2. Pawn d7 to d5. Black strikes directly at White's central pawn on e4, establishing an immediate presence in the center. 3. Pawn e5. Caro-Kann Defense, advanced variation. White chooses to push past Black's pawn instead of capturing it. White gains space in the center and restricts Black's king-knight from utilizing its natural f6 square. 3. Bishop c8 to f5. The hallmark advantage of the Caro-Kann compared to the French defense. Black develops the light-squared bishop to an active square outside the pawn chain before closing the door with e6. 4. Knight b1 to d2. Instead of the standard main lines like knight c3 or knight f3, White plays a flexible systems move. White prepares to maneuver this knight over to b3 to keep pressure on Black's future pawn break c5. 4. Pawn e7 to e6. Black solidifies the pawn on d5 and opens the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop on f8. 5. Knight d2 to b3. White executes the plan. The knight on b3 acts as a guardian against Black's key central break, pawn c6 to c5, by adding control to the c5 square. 5. Knight d7 to d7. Black develops a knight to reinforce the center and support future pawn moves along the c-file or e-file. 6. Pawn h2 to h4. A sharp and provocative pawn thrust. White threatens to play pawn h4 to h5, trapping Black's bishop on f5. 6. Pawn h7 to h6. Black creates an escape hatch square on h7 for the light-squared bishop in case White pushes pawn h5. 7. Knight g1 to e2. White continues development, aiming to swing this knight toward the g3 square to challenge Black's bishop on f5. 7. Knight g8 to e7. Black develops the king's knight to e7, keeping its options open to jump to c6, f5, or g6. 8. Knight e2 to g3. White puts immediate pressure on Black's active bishop on f5. 8. Bishop f5 to h7. Black retreats the bishop into the safety pocket created by pawn h6, keeping the long diagonal intact. Part 2. Breaking the center and board explosions moves 9 to 16. 9. Bishop c1 to e3. White completes another piece development move, defending the d4 pawn and preparing for potential queenside action. 9. Pawn c6 to c5. Black executes the standard center strike c5, attacking White's central pawn on d4. 10. Knight b3 takes pawn c5. White accepts the challenge and grabs the offered center pawn, opening up lines for rapid piece activity. 10. Knight d7 takes knight c5. Black recaptures White's knight to maintain numerical balance in the center. 11. Pawn d4 takes knight c5. White recaptures Black's knight with the d-pawn, creating a disrupted pawn structure on the c-file. 11. Knight e7 to c6. Black develops the remaining knight toward the center, targeting White's vulnerable pawn on e5. 12. Pawn c2 to c3. White reinforces the newly gained d4 area and safeguards the pawn chain. 12. Knight c6 takes pawn e5. Black recaptures the lost material by striking down White's undefended e5 pawn in the center. 13. Queen d1 to a4+. White launches a check on the open diagonal, aiming to pin Black's knight on e5 and set up tactical threats. 13. Knight e5 to c6. Black steps back to block the line of check, pinning the knight to the king on e8. 14. Bishop f1 to b5. White applies maximum pressure on the pinned knight at c6. 14. Queen d8 to d7. Black steps up with the queen to unpin the knight and protect c6. 15. King e1 to c1 queenside castling. Olo. White commits the king to safety on the queen side, while instantly bringing the a1 rook into action along the central files. 15. Pawn a7 to a6. Black questions white's bishop on b5, forcing white to make a structural choice. 16. Knight g3 to h5. A tactical maneuver. Instead of instantly retreating the bishop, white threatens black's kingside pawn on g7. 16. King e8 to c8 kingside castling. Olo. Black brings the king to safety on the queen side and connects the rooks for the middle game clash. Let's go to the part 3. The tactical melee moves 17 to 24. 17. Bishop b5 to e2. White preserves the light-squared bishop, retreating it to a safer square. 17. Pawn e6 to e5. Black grabs huge central space with a double pawn push, taking initiative across the board. 18. Pawn b2 to b4. White expands aggressively on the queen side to counter black's center dominance. 18. Pawn d5 to d4. Black pushes past white's structure, creating immediate tactics against white's bishop on e3. 19. Pawn c3 takes pawn d4. White opens up the central lines by taking the invading pawn. 19. Pawn e5 takes pawn d4. Black recaptures with the e-pawn, keeping the pressure high on white's e3 bishop. 20. Knight h5 to f4. White moves the knight inward, targeting key central squares. 20. Queen d7 to c7. Black aligns the queen along the c-file, setting up latent threats toward white's king position. 21. Bishop e3 to d2. White retreats the threatened bishop back to safety. 21. Knight c6 takes pawn b4. Black blows open white's queenside cover by sacrificing or trading for white's b4 pawn. 22. King c1 to b2. White steps the king to b2, escaping potential discovered checks along the c-file. 22. Knight b4 to c6. Black pulls the knight back to its safe, centralized outpost. 23. Bishop e2 to d3. White targets black's active bishop on h7. 23. Bishop f8 takes pawn c5. Black recaptures the pawn on c5 with the dark-squared bishop, activating another dangerous piece. 24. Bishop d3 takes bishop h7. White eliminates black's active light-squared bishop. 24. Rook h8 takes bishop h7. Black recaptures with the king's rook, controlling the open h-file. Let's go to the part 4. The pressure builds moves 25 to 31. 25. Knight f4 to d3. White places a powerful knight in the heart of the board, blocking black's passed d-pawn. 25. Rook d8 to d5. Black lifts the rook aggressively into central action to defend the d4 pawn. 26. Queen a4 to c4. White centralizes the queen, attacking black's d5, rook and targeting the weak points in black's camp. 26. Queen c7 to d6. Black reinforces the central rook with the queen. 27. Bishop d2 to f4. White develops a severe threat, skewering or pinning black's queen and central pieces. 27. Bishop c5 to a3 check. Black fires back with a sharp check, forcing white's king to move to an uncomfortable square. 28. King b2 to a1. White slips the king into the corner to safety. 28. Queen d6 to d7. Black steps the queen back out of the line of fire. 29. Rook a1 to b1. White takes control of the open b-file, aiming right at black's king position. 29. Pawn b7 to b5. Black aggressively expands on the queen side to kick white's queen away from c4. 30. Queen c4 to b3. White pulls the queen back to b3, keeping pressure along the b-file. 30. Pawn b5 to b4. Black pushes further to lock down white's queenside structure. 31. Queen b3 to c4. White maneuvers the queen back into a dominant central square, keeping eyes on key infiltration points. 31. King c8 to d8. Black steps the king away from the exposed queen side to seek shelter toward the center. Let's go to the part 5. The final breakthrough moves 32 to 39. 32. Knight d3 to c5. White posts a devastating knight on c5, attacking black's queen and threatening brutal tactics on b7 or a6. 32. Queen d7 to f5. Black tries to counterattack white's bishop on f4. 33. Knight c5 to b7 check. White delivers a forcing check with the knight. 33. King d8 to d7. Black's king is forced to step further into the open field. 34. Pawn g2 to g4. A brilliant tactical blow. White attacks black's queen, deflecting it away from crucial defensive duties. 34. Queen f5 to e4. Black seeks active counterplay by placing the queen on e4, threatening white's rook. 35. Rook h1 to e1. White develops the final piece with maximum power, placing black's queen in immediate jeopardy. 35. Queen e4 to f3. Black's queen shifts to f3, desperately looking for counterchecks. 36. rb1 to b3. White cuts off all tricks. The rook defends against queen threats along the third rank. 36. Queen f3 takes pawn f4. Black eliminates the white bishop on f4, but black's king remains totally exposed in the center. 37. Queen c4 takes pawn d5 check. White grabs the rook with a brutal central check. 37. King d7 to c7. Black's king tries to hide behind its own remaining pieces on c7. 38. Rook b3 to f3. White's rook executes a decisive tactical swing, attacking black's queen while maintaining full control over the board. 38. Bishop a3 to b2 check. Black throws in a desperate countercheck with the bishop on b2. 39. King a1 takes bishop b2. White safely takes the bishop on b2. Black resigns here. White's attack is completely overwhelming, with decisive material and positional advantages. 1-0. Thank you so much. God bless you. See you in the next video tomorrow. Okay.